Hi, AP. This is period two review, part two of four, where we talk about slavery. The first slave ship arrived to the New World in 1619 in Jamestown. Early on in the 17th century, so from 1619 till about 1676, a vast majority of people that were working here were indentured servants versus slaves. So, what indentured servitude was, is people in England, for example, would have their passage to the New World paid for, but in return, the person that paid for their passage would get their labor for a period of time. Usually it was 7 years. Usually after that 7 year time period, you were granted a piece of land. Not every indentured servant got the land that they were hoping for, or they might get land that was fallow, that was not able to be cultivated. The reason that there was such a huge labor supply early on, so indentured servants were coming here, is because in England you had something called the enclosure movement, where they were taking away common lands that people used to be able to graze their cattle on, sheep. So they're looking for basically a way of life. So they would come to the New World hoping that would be where they'd hit the jackpot. As time wears on for indentured servants, when the English economy improves and political stability comes about, there is more of a shortage of labor, so it's harder to find laborers. So they started to increase the number of Africans that were imported into the colonies. The reason I mentioned 1676 as being a turning point year, that was the year of Bacon's Rebellion. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon and a group of people that included indentured servants, free blacks, enslaved people, attacked Native Americans on the frontier because they felt that the Virginia governor and that the powers that be, the House of Burgesses, were not allowing for the movement westward. That's going to be a hallmark of early America, is that desire to move westward. The rebellion failed, but what it did was it actually improved life for indentured servants because laws were passed that made their life better. But it actually was very harsh on blacks and slaves in the colonies. So you start to see this, division, and you start to see more of an increase in slave labor because they need people who are going to be there as laborers more permanently than indentured servants were. At the beginning, a vast majority, and throughout the days of slavery, a vast majority of slaves went to the Caribbean and South America. Barbados becomes the island that's the blueprint for what slavery is going to look like in the Americas eventually. Barbados is an island that starts with growing tobacco, but eventually they're going to start to grow sugar, and it becomes amongst the most profitable colonies in the New World. So the British own Barbados. They codify the slave system. By 1660, it's slavery is racially based. Slavery is, you inherit it from the mother. So if your mother was a slave, you are a slave. Because cash crops were in such high demand, places like Barbados, they don't grow anything but sugar for the most part. So the colony of South Carolina think of South Carolina as being like Barbados, but in what is now the United States. Their big cash crop becomes rice. Rice was not really something that people in England were desiring, but what they would do is they would trade that rice to Barbados because then they were able to feed the slaves in Barbados with that rice. In South Carolina, becomes a colony that's majority slave, heavily influenced by slavery. Charleston becomes the big port city in South Carolina, and the coastal cities, not just in the south of what would become the United States, but all the way up to New York City, Boston, are engaged in the slave trade as well. And as we begin to see, even if you don't own slaves, if you're a backcountry farmer of German ancestry, Scots, Irish, whatever, and you don't have much, you still rely on the planter elites to market your products and to advocate for you politically speaking. So even if you're not a slave owner, you are still indebted to slavery as a system. Just a couple of things to talk about. The Royal Africa Company was formed in 1660, and you've heard of the Middle Passage before. The Middle Passage is the absolutely brutal, unthinkable ships that would take slaves from Africa to the New World to be sold into slavery. A third or more of the people did not survive the Middle Passage. They were laid on racks. They were fed poorly. It was a terrible, terrible trip. Triangle trade develops. The New World, you have raw materials that would go to Great Britain to be turned to manufactured goods that would be sent all around the colonies.